Now like to do the Bible reading. So Matt's got us looking at some of what he's covering today in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So we're looking at verses 1 to 7 today. Now about the gifts of the Spirit, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, somehow or other, you were influenced and led astray to mute idols. Therefore, I want you to know that no one who is speaking by the Spirit of God says, Jesus be cursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same God at work. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good.
Morning, everyone. Once again, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Matt, just in case we haven't met, and I'm one of the leaders here at MCC. And this morning, and for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be working our way through 1 Corinthians 12. You may be glad to know that once 12 was done, there's only 3 chapters left, given that Tim covered chapter 13 with a great sermon last week. So I know it's been going on since the start of the year, but I live in hope that we may actually be finished 1 Corinthians by Christmas, like this Christmas. Yeah, we'll see how we go, but that's on the cards. Just in case you haven't been here before, or you've understandably dropped in and out of this sermon series, we are looking at a letter, the first letter that we have in our Bibles, that Paul, the apostle, author of much of the New Testament, addressed to a church that he planted and started in a place called Corinth. Corinth was part of the Roman Empire, had a Greco-Roman culture. It was originally Greek, but the Romans obviously took it over. And Corinth was a really bustling, cosmopolitan city at the time. So lots of commerce, lots of entertainment, lots of spirituality / religion, a few wealthy people, lots and lots of not so wealthy people. But it was a place that you could kind of characterize by ambition. So it was a great place to try to make something of yourself. So climbing the social ladder, bettering your social position, chasing status, all that kind of stuff was big, probably admired, probably encouraged in the city of Corinth. And there's a good chance that that attitude had filtered through to the church, because Paul is clearly dealing in this letter with a bunch of issues, problems that had arisen in the church at the time that people had sent to him via letter as well as messengers. So a heap of this letter is Paul responding, again, to issues and challenges in a church that he planted that seemed to be doing pretty well, but it was still really young, still in its infancy. And we're fortunate, blessed enough to have that captured through the ages for us to learn from as well. So all that brings us to the topic of chapter 12, which is spirituality, and specifically what we commonly refer to as spiritual gifts. Spirituality and giftedness, as confronting as it can be, are one more, I guess, means that can be misused as a status-seeking device, if you like, as a way to bolster egos, as a way of establishing our sense of superiority over other people, even in a church setting. And even at its worst, spirituality and spiritual gifts can be misused as a way to exert control over other people in a way that does not characterize the life and the attitude of Christ whatsoever. So it was probably being misused at the time at the church in Corinth, and I think it'd be naive for us to think that we're better than them or superior to them. They weren't really aware of it being misused, and we are always running the risk of being blind to that possibility as well. So that's the background as to what we're going to be dealing with today. Now, before Paul goes into the details regarding the specific spiritual gifts that we get to later, he starts off by offering 2 criterion, if you like, for true spirituality. And by true spirituality, we're talking about when someone is operating through the power, if you like, or the agency of the Holy Spirit. So when their giftings are being empowered by the Spirit for the Spirit's purpose. So when someone is not just operating, if you like, purely in their own strength. So last fortnight, we looked at the first of these criteria. So does our spirituality, when I'm exercising the gifts and the talents that God has given me, does it come from a life that follows Jesus as Lord? And by Jesus being Lord of our lives, we're talking both about a verbal confession. Do I say, can I actually speak the words authentically that Jesus is Lord of my life? But just as, if not more importantly, if you looked at every single domain of my life, my finances, my relationships, if you like, my priorities, my aspirations, my attitudes, do they all come under the authority of Jesus? Do they mirror Jesus's priorities, attitudes, and aspirations? In other words, Jesus as Lord means I don't have any room for a compartmentalized spirituality. I can't just be a Sunday Christian. My faith has to follow me all the way through Monday through to Saturday. That's what we meant by Jesus as Lord. So that was the first criterion. This week, it's the second. Does our spirituality go to a place where it's all about serving others, other people? Does our spirituality and the use of our gifts go to a place where it's primarily about serving others? Now, I'm not sure if you caught it, but sadly, the month of July has been a big month for celebrity deaths. And particularly the deaths of celebrities, the passing of celebrities, the people of my generation, a lot of us grew up watching and observing. So I spent my fair share in my youth watching WWF, as it was known back in the day, and following the exploits of people like Hulk Hogan, and his many feuds and alliances with some of his wrestling contemporaries such as Macho Man Randy Savage, Hillbilly Jim, and Andre the Giant. And in hindsight, it's no wonder that Matt Bain has always seen a pretty boring and plain name after hearing all that kind of stuff, So that's one. And again, if you're my age and stage and you had any kind of interest in music growing up in the 80s and 90s, you probably came across the work in some shape or form of Ozzy Osbourne, who died maybe like last week as well. He would have appeared on your radar. But there was also a third and slightly lesser known, almost icon of my childhood, who also passed this month as well. And a guy that I probably, over the years, spent hours watching and imbibing early Saturday morning, and usually Sunday mornings as well, while I was desperately waiting for the cartoons to come on. And that, of course, was Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart, one of the world's most famous televangelists, died a couple of weeks ago at the age of 90. His fame peaked, I believe, like in the late 80s, maybe like early 90s, but he was still working through, I think, until earlier this year, I believe. Now, I read the New York Times obit of Swaggart and discovered much that I didn't know about him, and just like that name alone, Swaggart, Jimmy Swaggart, that could also, I thought about it, be a WWF's wrestler's name, and it's a whole lot cooler than Matt Bain as well. But one of the things that I found out about him is that he was first cousins and childhood friends and lifelong friends with the famous rock and roller Jerry Lee Lewis. That was news to me. Yeah, Jerry Lee Lewis. So in case you don't know much about Jerry Lee Lewis, he was a contemporary of both Elvis and Johnny Cash. He was a pioneer of both rock music and rockabilly, and probably most famous for Great Balls of Fire. That was him. Now here's the thing. You've got a celebrity preacher and you've got a rock star. Both could sing. Swaggart had a fantastic voice. Both, it turns out, could play a really mean piano. Both were dynamic and captivating frontmen and performers. Back in the late 80s, there was a sociologist who was studying evangelicalism at the moment. And he wrote back there in the late 80s of Jimmy Swaggart, he wrote, "I don't know of anyone in America, religious or secular, who can hold a crowd better." And that same researcher had a friend who was a lawyer. And the lawyer told the sociologist, "I don't believe a word he," Swaggart says, "but I don't know anyone in the world who's better with a closing argument." So thinking about it, I'd wager that Jerry Lee Lewis probably had the gifts to be a televangelist in the 80s and 90s if he'd gone down that path. And I also reckon that Jimmy Swaggart had what it took, should he have chosen to be a rock star in the 50s and the 60s, should he have chosen that path. So my point is this. Both those guys were similarly talented and gifted. One took those talents and directed them primarily into rock and roll and entertaining. And the other took those talents and capabilities and directed them towards God and church. Now, I know, as many as you do as well, also know that Swaggart was far from perfect. He had public moral failings, and his style of ministry, which resulted in things like a private jet and a luxury fleet of cars, is far, far, far from exemplary. But part of me thinks that just further proves the point. God gifts people through both nature and nurture. But those gifts may or not be spiritual in terms of how they are exercised. Does that make sense? In the sense that the person who has those gifts that God's gifted them through nature and nurture may not use them under the lordship of Jesus, the criteria from a fortnight ago, and they may not be using them primarily for other people's good. They may be using them for their own purposes. So being gifted in that sense, even if that gifting has a spiritual veneer over it, even if those gifts seem to result in material blessings, as in Swaggart's case, is not enough. It is not enough simply to be gifted. It is not enough just to have the capabilities. They have to be directed from a life that is under the lordship of Jesus and directed primarily towards serving other people that God has put in your life. Does that make sense? That's important. So keep that in mind as we look at the second criterion today. Does our spirituality and our gifting go to a place where it's all about serving other people? Now, if you haven't done so already, please take your Bibles, crack them open to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and we'll start off by looking at verses 4 to 6. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 to 6. You can see from the language that Paul uses as to what some of his primary concerns are when it comes to spiritual gifts. So, for instance, verses 4 to 6, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same God at work. So 3 words translated into English that come up on high rotation here. Different, but same. Different, but same. Paul seems more concerned, given the language that he uses, to emphasize the unity of the source, the sameness of the source of the gifts. They're all from God, as in Spirit, Lord, which can be seen as Jesus, and God. They're all from the same source, rather than emphasising the variety of kinds, degrees, and results of those gifts. Paul's concerned about the unity, the sameness, more than the diversity. So he emphasises the unity of the source of the gifts more than the diversity of their expressions. So you think, well, why would Paul want to do that? Why would he place the emphasis on the unity of the source rather than the variety of expressions? Well, there's a good chance that in Corinth at the time, the different kinds of gifts were starting to cause divisions within the church at Corinth. Gifts were being associated with degrees of spirituality and a hierarchy, if you like, of spirituality. And in Corinth, reading between the lines, and those lines come from the surrounding chapters here of chapter 12, speaking in tongues was probably seen as being the most spiritual, the highest, if you like, the most desirable gift. And so if you didn't have that particular gift, there was a risk that you would be viewed as a second-class Christian. So Paul wants to combat, again, the potential misuse of spirituality and spiritual gifts. And he does so in a couple of ways here. Firstly, the term that most translations render as kinds or varieties there in verse 4, so there are different kinds of gifts. This could, to some degree, it's probably more accurate, but it's a really kind of, I guess you could say, chunky, clunky translation. But you could take that word different and more accurately translate it as apportionings. So there are different apportionings of spiritual gifts. Now this may seem minor, but it really matters. So just imagine this. You go to any kind of regular wedding reception these days, and usually it's a case of there are 2 types or 2 varieties or 2 kinds of mains that are available. And the serving staff decide whether you'll get the chicken or whether the person next to you is going to end up with the chicken and you'll end up with the fish. And I swear that they are sizing you up beforehand to see if like fish or chicken would be a better suit for you, whether you kind of deserve the chicken or whether it looks like you can actually like do with the fish. And so they're apportioning it. The serving staff are actually apportioning it. You don't decide the kind of dish. You don't decide whether it's chicken or fish to start off with. And you don't even decide whether you get the chicken or the fish. And even then, you don't decide as to whether you get the slightly generous a portion of chicken or whether you get the slightly measly size of chicken. Which means you can't take any credit or any status from it. Does that make sense? It's apportioned to you. And you see, Paul makes the same point again in verse 11 there. All these gifts, the work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. Just as he determines. He apportions them, not us. So the Spirit determines the gift, the degree, and the result, not the recipient. So that's Paul's first move to counter potential division when it comes to spiritual gifts. Here's the second. Hopefully you remember from a fortnight ago when I did part 1, I pointed out that in verse 1 of this chapter, Paul doesn't use the term, in the original Greek, he doesn't use the term spiritual gifts. He doesn't use the term spiritual gifts. Instead, it's more spiritual things or spiritual people. But here's what he does in verse 4. He takes the term spiritual things or spiritual people and he drops in spiritual gifts deliberately. So he changes the term from just spiritual things or people to spiritual gifts. That is charis, charisma, charismata. And why would he do this? Because again, chances are the Corinthians were likely getting hung up with spirituality and spiritual talent. And it's easy to misuse and even misthink about spirituality and talent as a source of pride or ego. It's not, for example, it's not difficult to equate feeling spiritual with being spiritual. But it's harder to fall into those kind of traps if you see your talents, your gifts, and your spirituality as gifts that you exercise, again, for the sake of others. So Paul seems to change up that language deliberately, with intent. He wants to kind of take the focus from spiritual things or spiritual people to no, spiritual gifts. Because look at verse 5 there in front of you. Paul writes that there are different kinds of service. The gifts are for service. They're all for service. And you may think, well, that's kind of obvious. Like, what else would the gifts be there for? How else could we possibly use the gifts that God gives us? But if you think about it, there are plenty of ways to misuse the gifts that God gives us. We can use them for ego stroking. We can use them for status enhancing. We can use them for platform building. So the emphasis, again, Paul wants to make is they are for service. So one commentator, I couldn't track down his name, but wrote this, and it's such a great quote. Service is how gifts become real in practice. It's not so much having a gift as being a gift. It's not so much about having a gift. It's about being a gift. That's powerful. That's good. And even Paul, the founder of the church in Corinth, the great apostle who had had a personal encounter with Jesus, even he chose the term servant to refer both to himself and his fellow leader Apollos way back at the start of this letter in chapter 3, verse 5. That's his preferred title for himself. Even the mighty Paul was first and foremost a servant. So to summarize where we are in verses 4 to 6, Paul is stressing the apportioning, so the degree or the size of the gift. And he's also stressing the type of service, the variety of gift, if you like. And he's also stressing that the variety of effects or results or workings of that gift. All these three things, the type, degree, and effects of spiritual gifts, they are all from God. They're all from God. Now, that is not to say that people can't hone or develop or work on and improve their gift. And I think that we should honour the efforts that people make to do that. But we're still working with materials, if you like, and within parameters that we've been given, at best, that we've been given. And this is important, right? So if you and I, for example, are both gifted in the same way, so we have the same type or variety of gift. I was trying to think of something slightly farcical. So we'll go with financial administration. So just pretend that I'm really gifted with financial administration. You may be obviously and more innately better than me at financially administrating stuff, right? That may be obvious to everyone. You've got more kind of innate talent. If I believe that, again, the type and the degree of gifting are from God, then I don't have to get jealous about the fact that you are better at me than financial administration. Does that make sense? Because it's a gift, right? Secondly, you don't have to get a big head about the fact that you're better than me at financial administration. Assuming that we're both administrating for the sake of other people, you're not more spiritual than me because you're better at that. I'm not less spiritual than you because I'm not as good at you at that. Does that make sense? Same gift, different degree. I can't feel bad about that. I shouldn't feel bad about that. You shouldn't feel superior to me about that when it comes to spirituality. And that's really important. The foundational truth is we're both servants. And one of the ways that we serve is through our respective gifts and doses, if you like, degrees of financial administrating. And they were apportioned to us, and our degree of proficiency at those was apportioned to us by God for his sovereign purposes, not because I somehow or you somehow earned that. That brings us to our last verse in this little passage, verse 7. To each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Now, the word translated here, manifestation, is apparently a rare one in the New Testament. And it's likely to mean, depending upon its few other uses, public manifestation. And this would make sense in our context because in this little section, Paul is primarily writing to the church in Corinth in the context of their public meetings. So their public church meetings that, again, sometimes we read about in chapter 14, non-Christians would sometimes attend and come to. So that's probably the context. Regardless, the individual's gifts, again, are meant to be used for other people's good. Other people's good. And you can see this backed up earlier in the letter, chapter 10, verse 33, where he writes, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many. So this is the second criterion. Again, a fortnight ago, we were dealing with the first. This is the second. Are your talents being used to benefit others? Are your gifts being directed to serving other people as opposed to serving yourself? So let me conclude the talk by offering a couple of practical ideas as how this may play out in real life. First of all, what may this mean for MCC, particularly as a church? What may this look like? When I went through year 11, many years ago, I left a small high school and I moved to Calvin. And when I went to Calvin, I knew few people. Had to make new friends and felt that I had to re-establish myself. And it turned out at Calvin, when I went through year 11, that all the cool guys played basketball and all the cool girls would sit there over lunch and watch them play. I'd never played basketball before. I was left-handed, 5 foot nothing. But it was the 90s, and even then in the 90s, I couldn't even tell you who Jordan Michael was, you know. But it was like basketball or social ostracism. They were my two choices, right? So I played basketball. I played every lunchtime and every recess, and I got better. And I like to think that I kind of fulfilled my genetic potential. But let's face it, it was incredibly low ceiling. I still sucked by the end of college. And I never really, this is the saddest thing, I never really developed a sincere interest in it. And I would sometimes go home and ruminate on my lunchtime performance or lack thereof. And after I finished college, I never picked up a basketball again. But at the time when I went through, it was the only game in town. Now, the risk, I think, that we run as a church is that I'd suggest we can almost unconsciously think that perhaps there's only 2 games in town when it comes to spiritual gifts. Those involved in public speaking, doing something like being up here on a Sunday morning, and music. These can become the equivalent, if you like, of basketball for me in year 11. There are other things that you can do, sure, but it'd be the equivalent of me spending every lunchtime in the library with the guys who painted those little miniatures for role-playing games. It'd be like kind of like the equivalent of that. In Corinth at the time, it was likely that the gift of tongues was seen as the high status game, the game that if you really wanted to do something in church and be spiritual, you have that gift of tongues. But for us, here and now, it's probably stuff like preaching, communion, contributing during the open worship time, and doing music. The other stuff matters, and it's probably even like necessary, but the risk is that we don't view it as having the same kind of status. And if that's true, if that's a real risk, then it can have two really difficult consequences. It can devalue, first of all, those who are serving with other gifts. And it can make other people feel guilty or disappointed, maybe even like resentful, about not being gifted when it comes to any role that involves public speaking or music, and feeling like they're always stuck on the bench or they're playing on the B grade side. Does that make sense? And that's just simply not true. AV people doing AV stuff is just as spiritual. Like people who are talented at making coffee, helping create a really hospitable environment where people feel connected to each other and loved, that is just as spiritual. Sunday school teachers and helpers investing in the discipleship of our kids, that's just as spiritual. And those who have the gifts of admin, financial stewardship, organising, those guys looking after our collective resources and making sure that things run relatively smoothly, that is also just as spiritual. So there's no B team, if you like, at church when it comes to the gifts. There's no hierarchy of status of spirituality depending upon what your particular gift is. Secondly, as individuals, how are we going at utilising the talents that we've been given? Again, regardless of type and degree. Now, it can be difficult, I think, to be honest, to discern who we're primarily serving when we're part of a church. Let me explain. I can be keen to help serve and use my God-given talents at church. And it's not even church, I'm talking about some kind of voluntary organisation, maybe even in a family. You see these dynamics sometimes play out. But when I say that I'm keen to serve, I can drop in some subtle qualifications that actually make it, in truth, more about serving myself rather than serving other people. And here are just a few. I'm keen to serve, but I want to do it exactly on my terms. So look, really, Hoppo, I'm keen to get on board and help out on the music team, but I'm only going to play banjo. I don't want to attend rehearsals, and I insist on having like a solo every single song, right? But I really want to serve. Or I may not want to actually grow or develop when it comes to my gifting. So look, please, Adrian, I really want to be on the AV team, but just don't expect me to try to learn anything new because I don't have the time or the headspace, okay? Or not wanting to hear from the people who I'm supposed to be serving. And this is an example I couldn't possibly relate to. I'm keen to preach, but I don't really want to hear from anyone that my sermons are too long, dense, and I needlessly use too many big words. I don't know where that came from. So do you see what I mean? We can almost get precious about how we use our gifts as opposed to having that attitude of Paul's, servanthood for the good of other people. And here's what's hard. What's good for others, and I mean objectively good in terms of them becoming more and more the Christ-like person who God has called them to be, that may not match with my individual preferences or expectations about how my gifts are going to be utilised. And this can be really difficult, I know, and this can be even confronting. But I don't think we can afford to be naive about just how broken and sinful we are. And that brokenness and sinfulness is going to come out in terms of our self-awareness, in terms of the reasons why we do things. And lastly, absolutely lastly, if you're here, Christian or not, and you're doubting whether you've even got any gifts, or you're wondering what they are, please be encouraged. We're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks working through ways to discern, to find out what those gifts are. But here's the big takeaway. God has gifted you, each of you, all of you, with particular talents and capabilities. And they can be squandered. They can be wasted, if you like, again, chasing fame, status, self-glorification, building your own platform, bolstering up your ego, all that kind of stuff. And they can become great sources of disappointment for you as a result. They can lead to envy. They can lead to pride, because there's always going to be someone who is better gifted than you at the same thing, who's got a bigger degree, a bigger dose of the same gift. And if you invest your sense of worth before God as a person on that gift, you're always going to feel envious, if you like, of that particular person. But you can take those same giftings, those same talents that you've got, and you can direct them to serve other people and God in ways that will really seriously have eternal consequences, that will actually matter for something throughout eternity, because they're going to help develop and serve and grow other people into followers of Christ who will join us all through eternity. Does that make sense? So really, how you're made and what God can do with exactly how you're made, it matters. It matters in the most gravest fundamental sense. So it's worth exploring. It's worth being honest with ourselves about that. So if you've got any questions about your gifts, if you're uncertain as to how you're gifted, if you're uncertain, understandably, about your motives for wanting to serve and use your gifts, grab me afterwards, come down for the front, again, like always, for prayer with me and other people for anything whatsoever. But I'd encourage you, if you know the person next to you, grab them and ask them to pray with you about it as well, right? Like, we talk here about believing in the priesthood of all believers. Nothing stopping us from praying for each other and with each other on a Sunday morning either. So do that as well. Okay. Thank you. I'll pray and wrap up now. Father, I thank you for the variety of different expressions of talent and capabilities and giftings that you've given us. And I thank you even more for the unity that underlies all of those. I thank you for your Spirit in his wisdom, apportioning those to your people here at MCC to carry out your sovereign purposes. And I pray, Father, that we will be a group of Jesus followers who encourage each other in our respective giftings. I pray that we won't tie up giftings with status or hierarchy. I pray that we'll encourage each other when we see each other, hone and work on our gifts for the sake of serving each other, Father. But I pray more than anything, we will be motivated to serve you and each other out of a great love for you. Not pride, not fear, not ego, but just love and gratitude for the many, many blessings that you've given us. Amen.